Hi, as you're watching this video, it's obvious I cannot see your facial expression. But in the course of my practice of law, I often have the opportunity to explain what I'm about to explain to you, to clients face to face or over a Zoom, and I can see their facial expressions. And I often get the sense that like I'm bursting somebody's bubble, and it's as though I am telling them that the Easter Bunny doesn't exist. Well, I apologize. I apologize if I'm bursting your bubble as I talk to you about this. But here's the bubble bursting comment. Sometimes sellers and buyers have an interest in faking an artificially high price for a property. Faking an artificially high price for a property. Sometimes sellers and buyers have an interest in faking an artificially low price for a property. And one of the things that rationalizes, one of the things that enables people to feel good about this, to think that it's okay, relates to the personal property agreement, separate agreements for personal property. If you want to understand how, why, keep watching this video. All right, let me give you some examples. Some of you are thinking, well, I get it why a seller might have an interest in faking an artificially high sales price. It might establish a high comp that might have ripple effects for the sales of other parcels, other units, other houses that a developer is intending to sell. I get it, but why would a buyer agree to pay more for a property than the property would bear on the open market? Well, what if the buyer thinks it's worth $450, but the seller wants to have a recorded sale for $500, and the seller is kicking back $50,000 in unmarked, cold $20 bills, filling a briefcase handed to the buyer under the closing table? I'm not saying that exact scenario happens, but that works for the buyer. If the buyer is getting the kickback of $50,000, then the buyer might be tickled to buy the property for a fake price of $500. By the way, another reason the buyer might be willing to buy it for the fake price of $500 is to fake out the buyer's lender, because the buyer often is trying to borrow as much money against the property as possible. And if the buyer is getting faking the price at $500, they can borrow a lot more against that property than they could if the true price, net of the kickback, $450,000, was in the contract. Okay, you're thinking, all right, I get that, faking a high price. When would parties have an incentive to fake a low price? Well, think about a seller who's upside down. That is, they're selling the property that is worth $500. They have $600,000 of mortgage debt against their property. But if they sell it for $500, they're not going to net anything. All the dollars are going to go to the seller's lenders. So what if the seller and the buyer put together a contract for $450 with having a side agreement that says the buyer is going to pay another $50,000 to the seller under the table in cold hard 20s at the closing table? They're trying to fake the seller's lender that it's a sale for $450 when it's actually a sale for $500,000. Well, as you're watching this video, you'd say, well, everybody knows that's fraud. That's illegal. People can go to jail for that. You can lose your license for that. 100% true. Everybody knows that. And that is one of the reasons why, when these kinds of transactions are put together, there is never, at least I've never seen it, and I've been practicing law for 37 years, there's never a separate side agreement that's labeled fraudulent side agreement. It's never labeled fraudulent side agreement. It's never labeled side deal to kick back money to the seller in a short sale. It's never labeled side deal to kick the buyer money for overpaying for the property. It's not how it's ever labeled. It's always labeled, the side agreement is always labeled with something that makes it easier for the parties to rationalize that it's okay. What does rationalize mean? What rationalize means, at least in this context, is to justify in our mind something as being good, which is actually bad. And what is a common label for these rationalized side agreements? And by the way, we're all like this, and I'm the king of rationalization. Maybe not on this issue, but on lots of other things. I'm the king of rationalization. Our capacity as humans to rationalize is what allows us to go to sleep at night. If we were honest about all the bad stuff we did, we would never go to sleep at night. So we all rationalize. So what is the label that goes on top of these side agreements? Well, there can be a lot of different things, but one of the labels is personal property agreement. Because for some reason, when we call it a personal property agreement, even when, even in a situation where, for example, the personal property agreement allows the seller to transfer $50,000 worth of personal property to the buyer. And the personal property agreement says seller's going to, convey this, this new car or the golf cart or the boat, or the snowmobile or the 4 snowmobiles or the horses or the threshing machines or the farm equipment for $0. For $0. That allows our mind not to say, well, isn't that a kickback of that equipment that the buyer's lender doesn't know about? When the kickback to the buyer is not cash, but things like the developer paying for the buyer's homeowners association dues for 6 months or a year or something like that, somehow it allows us to engage our rationalization muscles in our brain, and it feels okay. And then same thing on the short sale side. In the short sale side, it's not an agreement. It's not an agreement for the buyer to pay the seller an extra $50,000 for the cash. It's the buyer paying $50,000 for worthless, junky furniture that's been beat up by skis and snowboards and dogs and VRBO renters and smokers in the ski condo. And that furniture usually trades for a value of $0. But when the buyer is paying $50,000 for that stuff to fake an artificially low price, somehow that makes us feel okay. So if there's a point about this, the general point about this is be very, very careful about personal property agreements that seem to either understate the value of the personal property or that seem to overstate the value of the personal property. Because it could be fraud on the mortgage lenders, it could be fraud on the tax assessors, it could be fraud on the public, it could be fraud on the market. Be careful. All right, now there's one other specific thing. The Division of Real Estate has created a personal property agreement for you. And the Division of Real Estate's personal property agreement has a lot of cool features about it. One of which is it allows the parties, the buyer and seller, to address how much the buyer is paying for this stuff. And a beautiful thing about the personal property agreement is the Division of Real Estate contract, the buy-sell contract for real estate, has a section 2.5.3. And there's a box to check. If there's a separate agreement addressing personal property, you check the box. You check the box. Of course, the buyer's contract needs to be given to the buyer's lender. If the buyer's lender doesn't notice the box is checked, if the buyer's lender does ask, notice, and say, oh, I need to see this personal property agreement, then obviously for the buyer to get the loan, you need to give them the separate personal property agreement. If they don't ask, if the lender does not ask, and at least the numbers are, in the range of reasonable, then I think I'd be able to successfully defend you in a case where the Division of Real Estate was trying to take your license for committing mortgage fraud. I can't guarantee it. And some of you have heard my line before. You know, when we came out of the Great Recession, the good news is I only had one client who went to jail. In addition to the bad news that one of my clients did go to jail, for that one client who did go to jail, there were probably about 50 clients of mine who had their licenses suspended, sometimes for long periods of time, and a few of them had their licenses revoked. You don't want to play around with mortgage fraud, fraud on the assessor, fraud on the market. Ladies and gentlemen, be careful. We live in a complicated world.